sure the Consulate General is on her way. I'm also assured by Chris and Dick that she's not held up at the border. She may be held up on the Champlain Bridge. That wouldn't be surprising. So we're going to start this morning with the second part of the program, the presentation of the results of our annual study. First of all, welcome on behalf of the Plattsburgh North Country Chamber. Thank you all for being here, and also welcome on behalf of the Can-Am Connection Council, the division of the Chamber responsible for this program and the study that we're releasing this morning. Some introductions, if I may. We have with us Matthew Dwyer, who's Vice Chairman of the Chamber, also Chairman of the Can-Am Connection Council, responsible for this. Star of Channel 3 News last night. We have with us from Senator Stafford's office, Tom Cronin. Thank you, Tom. I know Jimmy Langley will be joining us for the unveiling in a bit. We have with us from the county legislature, Celine Paquette. Celine. And I know we have Mayor Ian Stewart. Supervisor Andy Abdallah. Supervisor Teresa Sayward, Town of Willsboro. And I believe in the back, George Rivers. Right up on the road. Approximately 8 years ago, under leadership at the time of Mark, Mark Berry, who was dealing and really brought to the Chamber the whole notion that we needed to be more engaged in the whole Can-Am equation, that some significant things were happening, but we didn't understand them, we couldn't track them, we couldn't quantify them, and certainly we weren't entirely prepared to nurture them and facilitate them in the ways that we suspected needed to be done, that we could get a whole lot more value out of the equation if we did the right things. So whenever we have these, I always like to thank and commend Mark for really sending us down this road and doing all the things that we're doing with the Can-Am equation. But we knew 8 years ago, particularly at the time of the BRAC decision, when that hit us, and we knew that Plattsburgh Air Force Base was going away, that we didn't understand our economy in this area. In ways that we thought we understood it, we weren't sure that we understood it correctly. And there's an old adage that you're always afraid that the sky is falling if you don't understand what's holding it up in the first place. And it became singularly important for the Chamber at that point to help the area define and understand what was happening with the economy here, because we already suspected, in fact anecdotally from our members, really felt that we knew that the single biggest driving force in the North Country economy had already become, by the early 1990s, not Plattsburgh Air Force Base, not to say that it wasn't significant, but it wasn't the single driving force that people suspected it was, and not prisons, and not some of the things that if you ask most people would be the things that they would first tick off as the most important things in the area's functioning, that it was in fact this whole cross-border phenomenon in all of its many dimensions, including the increasing investment here by Canadian companies, their employment of North Country people, those real estate impacts, sales taxes, professional services. We knew that attorneys and customs brokers and accountants and insurance agents and so on were all providing increasing services to Canadians, not just those who had facilities here, but generally. Plattsburgh also seemed to be emerging as a support center, a service center for Can-Am trade. That we knew, again, anecdotally from our members, that even many Canadian companies and business people who weren't specifically doing business or putting something in Clinton County, who may be exporting or doing business in Texas, still needed services to do business down here, and we're looking to the service community in Plattsburgh to help them do those things, because at the end of the day, what service community in the U.S. would have more of a reason to become more expert at advising Canadians on doing business in the U.S. than the service community in Plattsburgh? I mean, how many Canadian businesses does an accountant in North Carolina deal with versus in Plattsburgh? That they were starting to recognize an expertise here that they were taking more advantage of. So all of those things we wanted to track. And we looked comprehensively at it from the sense of trying again to define the economy. And even at that time, if you'd ask people, what's going on with this Can-Am connection, and what's that about for the area? And even then, first of all, they wouldn't for the most part, have said it's the most important thing. And then if they said something about it at all, they would have said, oh, it's terrible, they're not coming here anymore, the exchange rate's bad, and the stores are closing in the mall, so there is no Can-Am connection anymore. And we knew that wasn't the case. It was changing, it was evolving, but it was still big, but it was big in new ways, and in some ways actually big in more important ways. I mean, I think frankly everybody in this room would agree, give us a manufacturing job versus a retail job, if given the choice. And in fact, retail jobs will then flow from things like manufacturing investment more than being dependent on retail, which should be an outcome rather than an end. So some good things were happening, but we couldn't explain it to people. And that's why we came up through our Can-Am Connection Council with some support at the time from Empire State Development with a means of quantifying this equation, quantifying the impact of Canada on Clinton County. We needed to pick a discrete jurisdiction so we could get a handle on things like real estate taxes and so on. So we defined and took Clinton County, but really then I think particularly over time becomes an example that you know these things now are actually rippling beyond Clinton County. So, but it gives you a point of evidence of what's happening. And we thought of every sector in the beginning where, again, anecdotally, we had reason to suspect there were significant things happening. So, yeah, we took retail and tourism because guess what? By the way, before we did this, nobody ever even really tried to track that. We all kind of talked from the gut. Well, we think it's this percent. We think it's that much, but nobody really documented it. The best documentation we had were license plate counts at the malls. That was really the only thing we used to reference in terms of how many are coming here and how much do we think they're spending here. So we got a handle on that. But then we went, as you have heard, so most of you in the past and are going to hear in a bit, we looked at all the other sectors, the industrial investment that we knew was happening there, and then the payroll effect and the number of Clinton County people being employed directly by all these Canadian companies and businesses investing and opening down here. Real estate, the taxes that generates, and the sales tax revenue generated for the counties and the towns, and all those professional services I mentioned, how much business is being done by the accountants and the attorneys and insurance brokers and the customs brokers, etc. And we went beyond that. We looked at things like media. We knew there were impacts there in terms of advertising expenses, tapping Plattsburgh's reach into the Montreal market, for example. Energy, everything we could think of. And then, interestingly, what's happened over time is that this year we added a sector for the first time, and you'll hear about it, which was healthcare. Because several years ago we didn't think of that as a significant impact, but now we began to realize, gee, that's kind of opening up here now, that people from Quebec in particular are coming down here and accessing healthcare services. And so let's get a handle on that and add that to the equation. So you're going to see that for the first time. And we hope over time that when we see something new happening, we'll add it to the study as we go forward. But we knocked people's socks off, I believe, when for calendar year 1994, we demonstrated all of those sectors put together a number of $784 million US. And the thing to understand about many of these numbers is that, as incredible as they sound, they're actually conservative, because we've always taken a very conservative approach to this. We don't do extrapolations. We don't do assumptions of what the rollover impacts of expenses are. It's just the direct impacts. How much business did you do? And in many of these sectors, it is only what is reported to us, even though we may know we don't have 100% response to a survey in a given sector, and so we know there's more out there that didn't get reported. We're not going to make assumptions about that. We're going to report only what was reported. So that makes some of these numbers even more astounding to contemplate when you realize they're actually conservative numbers. There's actually more out there we know we didn't capture. If we captured it all, they would be even bigger. That defined this economy as being about the Can-Am connection. And I think it's been a useful tool for our economic developers, our elected officials, and so on, to make proper decisions and planning and marketing efforts and where we should be taking care of things and nurturing things once you know how big it is, how significant it is, and how pervasive it is, that this is in fact an integrated economy now. It's not about boxes going back and forth across the border and up and down the Northway. It's about, we've become fond of saying, the Plattsburgh area truly becoming Montreal's U.S. corporate suburb, and the numbers show that. We now committed to updating that every 2 years, so that it wouldn't just be a one-shot experience. Well, gee, that's wonderful. We know it's big, but then what happened, 5 or 10 years later, we'd be sitting back referring to numbers that don't matter anymore because they're too old. So we made the commitment to updating it every 2 years. We've done that, and what we're going to hear this morning is the most recent update for calendar year 2000 of all of those numbers. and then we'll be joining and actually unveiling a couple of perhaps the most interesting or the things that people most anticipate. You see these two signs up here. At the end of this morning, we're going to ask a few folks in the audience to join us in unveiling that sign over there, which is that big compiled number of the impact for 2000. And this sign here is actually the direct employment numbers. How many Clinton County people are directly working for Canadian employers and border-related businesses? What's the percentage, and how has that grown in the last 6 years? And that number is going to knock your socks off, too. So we're also going to unveil that to you this morning. I want to thank a few people who helped with this before I call on Shauna. There are a lot of people that help with this, but it's a very complex, comprehensive study. It's the only one of its kind. It's something I think we can be proud that we do here. We devised, with Shauna's help, the methodology for doing this. Nobody had done it before, so back in '95 we had to go out and figure out for each of these sectors what kind of survey do we do, what kind of approach do we use to hang a number in this particular sector that's meaningful and correct. And we require the help of a lot of folks to now make it work. New York State Labor Department, we can't thank enough. They help us generate the payroll numbers and so much else that goes into to the numbers that we're presenting. And Alan Vidic and his team put a lot of assistance into this. All the county officials, particularly County Treasurer Janet Dupree and the Real Property Tax Service Office for their help. Our economic developers who help us come up with the leasing numbers and equipment investments by companies in their industrial parks, the Development Corporation Park and the City Community Development Office. We thank them. And then particularly all the respondents, all the hundreds of respondents out there who got those surveys and took the time to go back to their data and complete them and give us that information. We have significant, once again, significant response rates in all of the sectors, and without that, we not only wouldn't have the full numbers, we wouldn't be sure that the trends we're seeing are in fact correct. We also, at the conclusion, we just tease you at this point. When you leave this morning, you're going to get this brochure. We just don't want you looking at it through the breakfast. We want you to pay attention to the presentation. But then we will give you, as we always do, a summary piece that summarizes the numbers that you're going to hear. So you don't have to sit there and make copious notes of what Shauna says. You'll get a summary. And a complete copy of the report also will be accessible if you want one at the chamber. We can provide you with a copy. And I want to thank several people for helping to underwrite this study and the brochure that we'll be using for the next 2 years as an educational and marketing tool for the area. Harris Beach Development Corporation, Park, ETS, New York State Labor Department, Northeast Group, and Tower Group. And if you please give them a round of applause. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce at this time Shauna Ratner, who's president of Yellowwood Associates of St. Albans, Vermont. They conduct and coordinate this study and also maintain the confidentiality of it. I don't know any of the responses, and I don't want to know, the chamber doesn't know. And helping to do this in a professional, confidential way is one of the reasons why it has become credible, and also why we've been able to continually increase participation in it. Shauna, come up and tell us some of the numbers.
Thank you, Gary. It's nice to be with you again this morning. It's beginning to feel like a bit of a tradition for us, and it's a nice one. So I'm here today. I'm going to review for you and with you some of the findings of the most recent replication of the Canadian Connection, Canadian Impact Study for Clinton County. There were 8 sectors included in the study this time around. First is the export sector. Second is real estate. Third is Canadian visitor spending. Next, we have border-dependent businesses and public border-related agencies. Energy, culture and education, healthcare, and marinas. And I realized as I went through this time around that marinas aren't really a sector in and of themselves. So next time around we may revise that. That's how it's structured at this point. Before I present the numbers, there's something I'd like to emphasize, and that is that our role in this, Yellowwood Associates' role in this, in addition to designing the methodology and helping to carry out the research, and as Gary mentioned so aptly and correctly, there are many of you who also contribute to this research effort, so it's not as though it's 100% our effort by any means. But our role really is to figure out what is going on. What's happened to the numbers? What's gone up? What's gone down? It's not to try to explain why. Why is a very interesting question. And why is really a question that I would urge those of you today and going forward from today to begin to think about and discuss on your own. And perhaps the Chamber would even like to have some forum to get into the why behind some of these numbers. I can tell you, and I will as we go through, the cases in which we are aware that numbers may be anomalies, or where we're aware that there may be a lot of movement that's due to one particular event in a particular year, but or changes in a particular firm. We won't tell you which firm, but we'll tell you that there's a very limited reason for the change in the numbers. But there are other areas in which, after having done this now 4 times, when you have 4 data points, you can begin to see trends. And there are in some of these sectors some discernible trends. And I think that, you know, as I said, we don't pretend to be able to explain what's behind all of these trends, but I suspect that many of you here in this room have insights into why those trends occur. And it might be very useful for you to discuss them with yourselves and decide whether they're trends that you want to impact in some way. So let me just start out with what is happening. And I have a few overheads here to organize these. Get this up. First, I want to look at export sales. All right. Where's the on-off button? And then the question is, does it work? And now there's a focus, which is where? Export sales. And we knew we'd get there. We have the numbers. It's a matter of being able to see them. If you look at this, the U.S. Department of Commerce collects exports by zip code. And the zip code 129 covers Clinton County and parts of Franklin County. So this isn't only Clinton County, but it's pretty close. The numbers are pretty interesting. There was a real drop in 98 and a real further drop in 99. And now, in the year 2000, we're back up pretty close to where we were in 98. Okay. You can also see that the peak in these numbers was in 1997. And it'll be interesting to see where in 2002, 2004, whether we're going to grow back into that peak and past it, or whether it's going to level out closer to the 500 or so odd million range. Okay. Border-related businesses. And I'm not going to put up my charts here because I want to save Gary's thunder for the end. But I do want to talk to you a little bit about the sectors that are involved in border-related businesses. First is Canadian-owned businesses, and I want to let you know that there's been a significant increase in both the number of Canadian-owned businesses in Clinton County and related employment and payroll. There was a net increase of 28 Canadian-owned businesses between 1998 and 2000 in Clinton County. A net increase, and what this means is 40 businesses, Canadian-owned businesses, left Clinton County or went out of business between 98 and 2000, and 68 entered the county. So we're not talking necessarily about steady growth in all the businesses that entered in 98. There's definitely been fluctuation, but the net is on the upside. There's been an increase in employment by Canadian-owned companies in manufacturing, in trade and transportation, and in finance and services. There are now 3,538 jobs provided by Canadian-owned companies. That's an increase of over 1,000 jobs since 98. Payroll also has increased by $30.5 million between 98 and 2000. Approximately 40% of the increase came from firms who were already in Clinton County in 1998. So about 60% of that increase came from those new firms that opened up here. Canadian-owned businesses in Clinton County purchased over $21 million worth of machinery and equipment in the year 2000. That's an 86% increase over 1998. And it's the largest level of investment by Canadian companies in Clinton County that we've documented since 1994, since before 1994. That's a clearly, steadily increasing trend. Investments were about evenly divided between firms that have moved in since 1998 and firms that were here in 1998. Canadian business incorporations account for about 78% of all new business incorporations in Clinton County. We're going to talk about international border businesses. When we talk about border-related businesses, we include in that category both businesses that are here, that are owned by Canadians, and businesses that we assume would not be here if it weren't for the Canadian border. So those businesses include private sector customs brokers, warehousers, freight forwarders, truckers, duty-free shops, and trade consultants, other than lawyers and accountants because we deal with them elsewhere. Between 1998 and 2000, 16 international border businesses had gone out of business and 3 had entered the market. So there was actually a net decline in the number of international border businesses in Clinton County, a net decline of 13 businesses. Employment likewise fell to 749 from 864, so it was a relatively modest decline of employment, a loss of 115 jobs. Interestingly, employment increased in manufacturing, but it decreased in transportation and services and trade among international border businesses. The most significant decrease was in transportation and services. Payroll fell by approximately 3 million to 21 million, which is actually very close to the level in 1996. Public border-related agencies include Immigration and Nationalization, Customs, Border Patrol, General Services Administration, Food and Drug Administration, U.S. Department of Agriculture, the FBI, and the Clinton County Department's Lake Champlain Boat Patrol. In that part of the sector, there's been a very slight decrease in employment and payroll associated with these agencies since 1998, very slight. I'm going to let Gary tell you what that all adds up to. So I'm going to move on to real estate. Canadian-owned commercial property in Clinton County contributed $1.45 million in municipal and school property taxes in the year 2000. $1.45 million. That's an increase of 12% since just 1998, and it's an increase of 183% since 1994. International border businesses contributed $2.5 million in municipal and school taxes, virtually unchanged since 1998, but up more than 20 times since 1994. Canadian-owned residential property contributed about $393,000 in taxes in 2000, down by about $100,000 from 1998. Interestingly, the biggest drop in Canadian-owned residential property values is in seasonal homes, both waterfront and non-waterfront homes. Rental of commercial space to Canadian businesses increased by over 600,000 square feet between 98 and 2000, with most of the increase attributable to manufacturing and warehousing space. Clinton County landlords collected over $4.4 million in rent from Canadian businesses in 2000. This also has been a steadily increasing trend since 1994. Energy, very interesting. The value of natural gas purchased from Canada for use in Clinton County continues to go up. It's gone up from about $31 million worth of natural gas purchases in 1994 to $81 million in the year 2000. During this period, the volume purchased has about doubled from 10 million DTH, DTH is 1 million BTUs, to almost 20 million DTH. Canadian visitor spending. When we began this study back in 1994, we had one Canadian visitor survey that was conducted over the Christmas season. In subsequent years, we've had 2 surveys, one during the Christmas season and one during the summer months. The results that I'm going to give you for the year 2000 are based on the summer month survey, because that was the survey that had a more robust response. That survey was actually conducted in July of 2001. Excuse me. Border crossings were down 8% in 2001 compared to 1999. But estimated total annual spending of Canadian visitors was down 30%. Canadian spending at Clinton County marinas also fell significantly in the year 2000, and we think that that was probably due to heavy spring runoff, flooding, and poor weather conditions over that summer season. Nevertheless, the $193.7 million spent by Canadian visitors to Clinton County in the year 2001, based again in the year 2000, based on the data from the July 2001 survey, is 21% of estimated total gross sales of all industries subject to sales tax in Clinton County in 2000. So the point being that even though this number may be somewhat lower than it was 2 years ago, it is anything but insignificant. Further, the Canadian sales tax contribution is estimated to be 21% of total county sales tax revenue in 2000. Just to emphasize this, to generate the amount of sales tax revenue provided by Canadian visitors in the year 2000, each Clinton County property owner would have to pay an additional $2.10 per thousand in county taxes, property taxes. Healthcare. As Gary said, this was the first year in which we've added healthcare to the study. And I think it was a very smart move because there's a sense in the healthcare community that we're at the beginning of what may be a growing trend of Canadians seeking healthcare services to a greater and greater extent on this side of the border. In the healthcare sector, we defined the sector to include capital expenditures related to Canadian treatment made primarily by CVHP Medical Center, patient revenues, the value of ancillary services provided to Canadian patients, patient revenues related to the hospital, and then patient revenues from Canadians earned by a full range of physicians and healthcare providers in Clinton County. And in that range, we included nursing homes, we included acupuncturists, physical therapists, dentists, orthodontists, eye doctors, pharmacists, any care provider you can think of related to the healthcare sector was included in our survey of that sector. And what we found was that the total value of healthcare provided to Canadians in Clinton County in the year 2000 was over $3 million, with more than half of that in patient revenues. Financial and professional services. Average collected balances held by Canadian individuals and border-related businesses are up about 26% since 1998, but they're well below the levels of 1994 and 1996. It appears that in the banking sector there may have been a bottoming out in 1998, and we may be beginning to see an upswing. And again, as we continue to collect the numbers, it becomes clearer what these patterns really are. Accounting business with Canadians decreased significantly in 2000 from 1998, but based on the numbers, it would appear that the 1998 level was an anomaly. It was extraordinarily high. And our sense of that is that it was one or two firms that had extraordinarily lucrative contracts in that particular year. If you look at the numbers now, they're much more in keeping with the numbers in the previous years that the study was conducted. And in fact, the 2000 level on its own, even though it's well down from 1998, is 2.5 times higher than 1996. The value of legal services to Canadian individuals and border-related businesses was up substantially in 2000 over 1998. The value of insurance premiums paid by Canadians is approximately $5.5 million, down slightly from 98, but well above 96 and 94. The value of temporary services, and this is a very interesting one, provided to Canadian companies in Clinton County, you would expect, given the numbers in terms of companies moving in, that that number would go up. It's gone up enormously. It's gone up from about $500,000 in 1998 to $5.5 million 2 years later. That's a remarkable jump. Culture and education. There's a declining trend in media advertising receipts from Canadians. Receipts were down substantially in 2000 from both 98, 96, and 94. As I said, that does look like a trend. Interestingly enough, much of the decrease appears to be due to less advertising, not so much by Canadian individuals, but by Canadian-owned companies who are not located in Clinton County. In previous years, Canadian-owned companies not located in Clinton County found reasons to want to be using advertising media here, and that seems to be less true now. That's definitely an area where, I would ask those of you who are knowledgeable in the audience to think a little bit about why that might be. I don't myself have any clear sense of why that might be. Charitable contributions of Canadian individuals and businesses continues to rise. That's also a pretty clear positive trend. When we first reported in 1994, I believe that number was around $7,000 in charitable contributions from Canadian individuals and Canadian companies to charities in Clinton County. That number is now up to $93,000. I want to just remind you that there's a great deal more detailed information in the full report. Gary will hand you out the summary of that report. The full report's about 45 pages long. It's filled with a lot more detail than makes sense for me to try to present to you this morning. And for those of you who are engaged in particular sectors, you may find it worthwhile to look at that report and really begin to comb through some of the detail and see what that might mean to you.
Thank you, John.
Turn that
I know how to turn it off.
I'm going to juggle the order of things. I'm going to continue to tease you a little bit about the numbers that we'll unveil and hold those till after our other guest speaker this morning, who I'm very pleased to call upon at this time. Deborah McCarthy is the new U.S. Consulate General in the U.S. Consulate General in Montreal. A very important post and a very important person to us, given the numbers that you've heard and all the things that you know that we're working on in this area and our emerging relationship with Montreal and Quebec and Canada generally. There are many ways that the Consulate and the Consul General in Montreal can be of assistance to us. And our good friend Steve Kelly, who many of you know, who's been here to Plattsburgh many times and continues to work with us in many ways, and has really been the person who really grasped and understood this whole changing economic equation, particularly in this region. When he was Consul General in Quebec City and now in Ottawa, brings that background to that post. Specifically recruited this lady because he knew that she was someone who also shared that understanding of and that commitment to putting an emphasis on building this economic relationship for the good of both of our countries, and understanding that we have an integrating economy and we need to look at and do some things in different ways. So we're just very excited at the opportunity to work with her as a new partner. We've had the pleasure of meeting with her in Montreal recently, and Steve is right. She's dynamic, she understands, and we're convinced she is, in fact, going to be a very effective and important partner for us in the next couple of years. And of course, timing is everything too. This is a challenging time for her post, and really for all of the U.S. personnel in Canada, because we have had more intensive attention to the U.S.-Canadian border in the last 3 months than we've had in the last 300 years collectively. I can tell you that. And while it is for unfortunate reasons that have generated this heightened attention to our border, the fact is it has brought fresh attention, needed attention, to a lot of aspects of the U.S.-Canadian relationship that haven't had the degree of attention or understanding or support or backing with resources from Washington and Ottawa that they've needed in the past. It's been a relationship that has too often been taken for granted, doesn't need attention, doesn't need investment, doesn't need staffing and facilities, and it's okay. We've got other squeaky wheels to pay attention to. It's a squeaky wheel now. And some good things are coming out of that. And I know that she probably found herself in a much more demanding post in Montreal in recent months than probably would have suspected several months ago because of all of the demands related to border issues. And we look forward to her remarks and some timely insights into some of the discussions and some of the progress that's going on. Our good friend and our new partner, the U.S. Consul General for Montreal, Deborah McCarthy.
Good morning. I almost didn't make it here because the U.S. government issued car that I was given would not start. Like many other things related to what the government in the United States and the government in Canada are doing along the border, some things have long been ignored and need to be recalled. As an American diplomat, I spent most of my time overseas, and I must say it is a true pleasure to be assigned someplace where I can come home regularly. I've done a lot of work south of the border, and I've seen the emphasis that we've placed on our southern borders. For your information, our resources in Canada, that is the U.S. government's resources in Canada, rank far below the resources of, I would say, 6 out of our 7 Latin American trading partners. And given the disproportionate size of our trading and financial relationship with Canada, it is something that was quite surprising to me when I came up, and something that the new team, some of whom were recruited by Steve Kelly, is trying to work to change. And that includes our new ambassador, whom, as you know, was our former governor in Massachusetts. He alone is playing a big role in this. I would like to just mention a couple of things in relation to what we do at the consulate and the broader picture of what we're doing along the border. In the consulate that we have in Montreal, many of you assume that a consulate is a place where you just get visas. Well, it is true that we devote a fair amount of our resources to visas. Specifically, we process all immigrant visas for all of Canada, and most of those people are not Canadian-born. But we also do a number of other things. We have, as some of you do know, we have a commercial center that helps small and medium American enterprises go to Canada. Slightly different from what is being emphasized here, but I think it's still good to know. They also actually serve as a filter, and do not handle, but they serve as a filter for a lot of trade complaints, fraud. Fraud is becoming a major portion of what we're doing in Montreal. We're hoping for more law enforcement agencies to help us on that. But a lot of fraud tips come in through our commercial service, so they play a large role. We also have a section that does nothing but keep an eye on economic and political issues in the province of Quebec, keeping it in the national context. And more that involves linking up with our commercial partners on basically lobbying the Quebec government on positions, issues for companies. I mean, it varies. I recently spent an evening with many of the ministers and had a dinner with Prime Minister Landry. And amongst the many issues that we discussed related to free trade and what's happening along the border, I asked him plain and simple, I said, when was the last time your government put on a presentation for others on how you conduct your procurement? Now the response was, well, there's something on the website. And I said, well, a lot of people don't go to websites and wade through the minutiae. They'd rather have around the table a group of people that will explain it from A to Z, especially if they're new to the area. So I must say he happily agreed. We hopefully will see it soon. So that's what we do in economic and political issues. We also have basically what's called a public diplomacy arm. And that is, they do marketing. Marketing of our ideas, marketing of our, as I said earlier, our positions, whether it's on environment, whether it's on trade issues, whether it's particularly now, what kind of war we're waging, what kind of war we're not waging. The Quebec context is rather particular in that. What you read in the press is different than what you hear in the press in the rest of Canada. On the whole supportive, but once in a while there's that little tweak of something that I would call the French approach. And I recognize and respect it since I grew up in France, but at the same time it's not always what we are trying to convey. So there's a lot of marketing that is involved. For myself as a Consul General, I come from a background that is not that of my predecessors. They had mostly administrative and consular backgrounds. Steve was the exception. He had a respectable political background. My background is mostly economic and financial, and in the last 3 years have been engaged in many respects. I'm basically fighting for what we want for our companies, our business, our country, from the economic and financial perspective. In some countries it's easy to do because they often agree with us. In other countries, and I mentioned France, it is very difficult to do because each time you walk into a French government minister's office and you say, we'd like to do this, they say no. And then you go back and you rephrase the question or slightly change a position and you still get a no. So the art of negotiation comes in, and it has to be a well-developed art in some countries. I just want to make some remarks about the border. I know that you're all aware of the general overall trends, and the statistics today were very interesting on the serious impact that the trade that we has on a particular community and a county. Because trade is not just a large number of figures, it affects jobs, people's way of living, and the livelihood of many communities on both sides of the border. I would say that a couple of things. A lot of Americans do take Canada seriously. And I'm saying this here in an American context because I think it's worth repeating. There is the prevalent notion that Americans do not know much about Canada. It's true, many Americans do not know much about Canada. Canadians know far more about it. But that is changing dramatically. At the top levels, I have been shocked to see the number of principals out of Washington that, obviously post-September 11th, are going to Ottawa and meeting with their counterparts. You know, our Secretary of Treasury, Governor Ridge was there Tuesday and Wednesday, and a myriad of people that heretofore would have flown to different parts of the world, with the exception of an international meeting in Canada. But regular meetings, regularly sitting down with counterparts to hash out a new way of conducting our relationship would have been unheard of before. And I think that's important. The bulk of the visits have been on border issues, both security and trade. And each of them has basically revolved around the same theme, which is how to preserve what we have, that huge $1.4 billion a day relationship, with the new needs for tighter security. Now, some people on both sides of the border see this as a zero-sum game. That is, that any attempt to improve the border security results in a loss of prosperity. Both countries, the argument goes, have to choose between these two issues, security and prosperity. But in fact, there's no choice involved. In fact, the two goals are inseparable. Security, as you are well aware, is one of the foundations upon which we build our prosperity. Prosperity provides the social benefits that allow us to live in a secure environment. In terms of some of the more specifics of what we're doing, and I'll skip over some of the things I was given because I can tell by the audience that you already are well aware of it, and nothing like listening to a long list of statistics. Particularly specific, General Ashcroft was recently up in Ottawa and announced on the security side, and this played rather big in Canada, and unfortunately the headlines were not true to what he did, which is when he spoke of having the National Guard along the border. A number of the papers, particularly in the Quebec province, spoke about the militarization of the border. Now, we've had to explain to many an audience that this is not a militarization of the border. I have been on borders that are militarized. This is not a militarized border. And that the National Guard is going to do what it has done since post-September 11th in some cases for short periods of time, which is help speed up the processing. They're usually pretty enthusiastic for their tours, as they call them, or as I call them rather, and it's going to help the process. It's not a militarization. I think another thing to emphasize, which has not been in the papers, is that our National Guard are civilians doing reserve duty. So people say it's military. These are civilians who have left their jobs to do their duty. In Central America, where I was recently, we had a problem when the National Guard came down. It was seen as militarization. And when we explained that there were, plumbers and doctors and dentists and teachers and all sorts of people that were there doing something for this poor country, the headlines changed. The other thing they spoke about, obviously, are the changes that are going to take place across the border, and this was part of discussions with all the principals that have come up, from people to equipment. I know that it's taken a while to get money to the border crossing I just went through, and I'm happy to see that the hut, as I call it, that's going to house the new equipment that will be able to take what I call MRIs of trucks, is speedily being built, and I gather the equipment has been purchased. But without September 11th, none of this would have taken place. Well, it would have taken place probably, but over several years. And those unfortunate events sped up the process, which is going to make the trade flow more easily. Governor Ridge just finished in Ottawa, and though we do not have the specifics of what they signed on the dotted line, it's a series of measures to speed up things, not measures to close. It includes reinstalling, certain smarter programs, as they say, and commitments of funds to use, technology to speed up trade. The other thing, in terms of infrastructure, I know that the Transport Minister of Quebec came, had a meeting with the state of New York, members of the government of the state of New York, and announced several projects. I asked him last Tuesday night, I said, do you have the money on the Quebec side? And he said, yes. And I said, what is missing? And he said, well, we do need a little bit of money from the Ottawa government. I did not ask, nor do I know what specifically it was for, whatever. I said, well, are you sure you're going to get it when they unveil their budget on December 10th? He said, on that, yes. Then I asked him about another project he had announced with the governor of New Hampshire, which is Route, I believe, 33, but correct me if I'm wrong, that crosses into Vermont. I said, do you have the money for that one? And he said that he needed it from Ottawa. Now, as you all know, the transfers from Ottawa to Quebec are a bi-yearly negotiation, I think. And this year, parts of the budget were very much eaten up by security measures, parts of the Canadian budgets. I honestly do not know whether in the end, for the other road, whether the money was in there. But we have to go through the fine print of the December 10th budget. The other thing, there's going to be another aspect of what has been signed, and again, I don't have confirmation of it, but it should somewhere be in the documentation, and that is greater exchanges of information and intelligence between law enforcement agencies. I believe we have a U.S. Customs here today. We work very well with Canadians on a number of fronts, but there needs to be more rapid flow of information and greater integration in some efforts. We are used to operating in a decentralized way. Our law enforcement agencies, to some extent, at the state level. The Canadians do not quite operate that way, so they are learning how to change their way of operating in some respects. I was yesterday with the head of the Royal Mounted Canadian Police for all the province of Quebec, and he is extremely enthusiastic and happy at the new kinds of groups that are being formed on his side, task forces to deal with terrorism, and at the prospect of more formal cross-border collaboration. And that's going to be the basic underpinning of the new kind of relationship along the border. But again, it's going to be, and I emphasize on the security side, to help support the trade relationship which drives such a large part of our economy. So I'm glad to see that there is this attention being paid to the north and not just to the south. And we get down in cases to minor details when, upon being informed that some of the personnel that we had wanted that would work on border issues and also general administration in Ottawa were possibly being destined for Bogota, Colombia, because of another struggle down there. I think normally heads would have nodded and the resources would have gone south, but I don't think they're going to make it there. I think they're going to head up here. So I just wanted to give you an introduction of what we're doing, what we're focusing on. It's not the complete relationship, but I think it focuses a little bit more on the kinds of efforts and the kind of work that you do here. Thank you very much.
We have any questions for Deborah? Anything that you just heard about? Okay, well, if not, I have a presentation to make to Deborah, and then we're going to do two unveilings of the major numbers up here. Our presentation is a traditional gift. Her predecessor had one in her office, and her office when I was there looked empty without this little furry friend there in the office. Thank you for coming.
Oh,
this is Sammy Champlain, a limited edition fair representing our area's relationship with Quebec, going back to Samuel de Champlain. And we're happy to send this back to your office with you.
That's great. I'll
Thank
put it
you
in the
very
back
much.
window as I drive back.
We're going to unveil the two signs now, and we're going to do one at a time. And I'm going to ask I believe the three chief elected officials of the three Clinton County municipalities are with us this morning, perhaps, to come up and join in unveiling a sign revealing the direct employment impact by Canadian companies and border businesses in the county. Mayor, Supervisor, George, come on up, Mayor. We have two mayors and a town supervisor in the county here. These are your people who are working and filling these jobs and benefiting from this. And I'm going to ask you to please unveil, and let's see what the current numbers are total and the current percentage. What's the percentage number when they take this cover off of Clinton County residents employed by Canadian companies and border businesses in Clinton County? Take it away. $4,508 individuals, including the temporary service impacts, $128 million annual payroll, as you can see, compared to $59 million in 1994. 13.5% of the workforce in Clinton County now directly works for one of these employers. It's an amazing number. And now I'm going to ask, as has been our tradition, the chair of the Clinton County Legislature, Jimmy Langley, to come up for the big total number. And I'm going to ask our guest, Deborah. Where'd Deborah go? I'm going to ask her to come back up and join. Come on up and join Jimmy in unveiling the total, altogether, economic impact of Canada on Clinton County for calendar year 2000. All of those sectors you've heard about put together. Amazing number. $1,333,045,655. And that's U.S. If we convert that to Canadian, it'll really be a big number. Jimmy, any response?
Well, of course, the figures are huge, as expected. We know that there's a large impact in this county by Canadian dollars. We're certainly happy to have all the residents of Canada to come and live here and use our services, and we hope that they'll continue to do that and use it even more. Thank you all for coming in. Congratulations, Gary.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for joining us. Thank you all for coming this morning. Have a great Christmas and a great New Year.